Text reads Appomattox Paintings. Two men in National Park Service uniforms sitting in offices with books.
Okay. Well, everybody. Hello, everybody. I'm Ashton Farrell, Park Guide at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Sites, and with me is Park Guide Christopher Bingham from Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Park. And right now we are doing episode 14 of our U.S. Grant History Chat. And today our topic is going to be discussing some of the paintings done of the surrender that took place in the McLean House parlor at Appomattox. And first off, Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Ashton, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this.
Very well. My honor, Chris. It's been a long time. But a few things I want to ask you first. Basically, if the surrender of General Robert E. Lee to that of General Ulysses S. Grant was such a significant event, why was there no photographic image of the event?
Well, that's a great question, and that kind of leads into why there's so many different paintings. There is no photograph of the actual surrender meeting, and the basic reason for that, basic answer is the photographers, with all of their bulky equipment, and they could not keep up with the armies during the 100-plus mile running fight that was the Appomattox campaign. The surrender came together very quickly, with Lee's army being trapped at Appomattox Courthouse, and there was no photographer in the area when the event happened. That's the long and short of it, to be honest.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, because obviously we can't take pictures back then like we can now, of course, too. So yeah, very well, Chris. So then basically we're dealing with several paintings of the Appomattox surrender, and they're all a little bit all a bit different here. So let's start out with the first one that you mentioned, and hopefully I get his name right. But where you have the Louis Guillaume, am I saying that correctly?
I think it's Guillaume,
Guillaume,
a French
Guillaume.
French artist.
French
Yeah.
artist. Yeah. So can you describe a bit about Mr. Guillaume's 1867 painting, Chris, please?
I sure can. Basically, it shows the interior of the McLean parlor, as all of the following paintings will that we'll discuss. First of all, Guillaume actually visited the McLean family just about a year or two after the surrender, so he had an insight into what the room looked like. So the painting itself, to kind of describe it, very colorful painting, very colorful artwork showing the flooring that existed in the McLean House parlor at the time, which was very colorful carpet pattern, very red. You have bright red drapes on the far window. You have a fairly large-sized room, a little bit larger than it probably was in reality at the time, that we know it was. But you have various officers. You have Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee seated together at a small wooden table in the center of the room, and officers from both sides kind of behind them and to the side, with other period furnishings as well in the room.
Okay. Very well. Now, do you think the reason why Mr. Guillaume has Ulysses S. Grant and General Lee seated together at the same table, is that for some sort of maybe reconciliation, as they're trying to deal with this Reconstruction era, trying to reunite the country, or why exactly do you think he painted that way? Because, like you said, he visited the McLean family, so they were known about the two different tables, right?
They would have. McLean certainly would have known what was in his parlor, but a couple things. One, the room was fairly empty when Guillaume would have visited. A lot of the furnishings had been, shall we say, appropriated as souvenirs by some of the federal officers, some of which had been paid for. But nonetheless, those pieces that the generals had used weren't there. So he's getting descriptions from McLean about what was in the room, but he does show both generals seated together at a small oval wooden table, when reality would have been used by Ulysses S. Grant only, but he shows both generals seated on the opposite sides of it, which is very inaccurate to how it actually looked. But it very well could be a sign of reunion or reconciliation 2 years after the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Yes. Okay, so the same year we have Mr. McLean himself had a lithograph done of the surrender scene, I reckon, Chris. And basically, it looks a lot different from many of the paintings I've seen of the surrender. Can you describe the lithograph first and tell us a little more about it, please?
Certainly. Well, it was commissioned by Wilmer McLean himself. Basically, it's a little bit different looking because it's a lithograph instead of a painting. There are colorized versions of it that have been done, but it was essentially almost black and white at the time. There was a little bit of color to it. It shows a fairly large room, much larger than the actual parlor, which is interesting. McLean had it commissioned himself. It shows pretty accurately the furnishings in the room, artwork on the walls, the carpeting as well as it would have been. But that's where the accuracies kind of end. Yeah, the company that did it, which was, let's see, Major and Knapp Lithograph Company, excuse me, that actually did the work for Mr. McLean. They have kind of a who's who of the generals and other officers who were in the area at the time of the surrender, including some who were not ever in the McLean parlor. One of the more famous being George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac. He is not in the parlor during the surrender, yet he appears in the lithograph. Colonel Walter Taylor of Lee's staff appears there. He's never actually in the room either, and there are others. So it's a little deceptive.
Sure. And do you think William McLean, who obviously owned the house of the surrender event that took place, do you think he was looking to kind of cash in on what happened there, or what do you think?
That's very possible. I mean, McLean is someone who was looking to take advantage of a situation monetarily. He does that during the war through sugar speculation. That's one reason he's even living here at Appomattox Courthouse. One was to escape the war from the Manassas area, but the other was proximity to the railroad for his business. So no stranger to that. During the actual meeting, while Lee and Grant are putting pen to paper in the McLean parlor, there are accounts that Wilmer McLean is in the front yard speaking with federal officers, telling them his story, and that some are giving him money for his autograph. So he may have thought that perhaps this would be a money-making venture.
Sure.
He never makes any money off the house itself, but perhaps this was a way to maybe recoup some of his losses from the war.
Right. Business speculation, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. Always know how to make a buck, Will McLean.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, Chris, looks like we have a gap of time before our next painting here in 1895. Looks like about 30 years after the fact, by Thomas Nast, obviously the well-known political cartoonist in the Civil War, Reconstruction era, late 19th century era political cartoonist. Can you describe a little bit about Thomas Nast's painting in 1895 and the significance about that painting and how it's different from the other ones?
Certainly. Well, first of all, the previous paintings definitely portrayed Grant in a slightly different uniform than what he was actually wearing. I think it was Guillaume's painting showed him wearing 4 stars on his uniform. He hadn't achieved that rank at the time in 1865, but a dressier uniform that we know Grant was wearing. He was wearing a simple field uniform, ridden 20 miles to get there. But Thomas Nast's painting really starts showing Grant in a more realistic light. So to kind of describe this painting that Nast did in 1895, first of all, it was called Peace in Union was the name of the painting in 1895. It is a fairly zoomed in look at Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee shaking hands, presumably at the end of the hour-and-a-half meeting there in the McLean parlor. It shows a little bit of the room. You see a couple pieces of furniture. You see a large number of Union or federal officers behind Grant. But that's about as much detail as really comes through. It's not a very large look at the room. It's kind of a zoom in. So at the time in 1895, when Thomas Nast did this painting, you really start seeing nationally a lot more interest in the reconciliation theme, in the reunion theme. And I think that comes through in this painting, to be honest.
Okay, very well. So you think that's the reason why painted, say, in 1895 was more for that ability to try to reunite the country, basically, because the country come back together.
Exactly.
Okay.
You're talking about 30 years after the event, after the end of the war. Reconstruction is almost a distant memory by the 1890s. And though Thomas Nast, in his political cartooning, as you talk about, was a fairly pro-emancipation, pro-African-American civil rights during Reconstruction, by the 1870s, his views have largely changed, and he has really come around with the mainstream of many Northerners that Reconstruction was somehow this terrible mistake that had gone wrong.
Right.
And by 1895, he probably continued with that belief. So you see a lot of this reconciliationist theme by the 1890s.
That I understand. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Very well, Chris. So then moving on to Tom Lovell's painting. Now we're jumping another big gap in time, all the way
We
to
are
1965. Am I mistaken?
1965 for the
1965.
centennial.
Yeah, the centennial. So the centennial painting here. So can you describe a little bit about Tom Lovell's painting? And basically, as I remember, that was the painting that you folks, your staff, have put in the front of the McLean House parlor. So every time a visitor comes in, they see that painting, right?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
that's the one that's on display in the parlor, also in the visitor center,
and the
among
visitors.
others. But yes, it's the most prominently pictured depiction of the surrender. Yes, to kind of describe it, it shows most of the McLean parlor. It's a fairly zoomed out as opposed to Thomas Nast's painting. It shows, again, pretty vibrant colors of the carpeting, the very plain, otherwise interior of the room, white walls, simple black painted fireplace. Not an ornate room, really. It shows the furnishings accurately as to how they would have looked. And most accurately, for our purposes, it shows both of the generals seated in their proper locations in the room, to the best of our knowledge. Accounts state that Grant was seated on the right at a small wooden oval table, and Lee on the left at a larger marble top table. And that Tom Lovell's artwork shows that accurately. So in terms of why we use it as an interpretive tool for our visitors, is that the setup of the parlor today, if you visited this park, is based on the primary sources of the people who were there, of the officers who were in the room, as to who was where, what was where, and that's how the room is set up. And Tom Lovell basically did the same research and took the same take on it. So the painting and the room meet very well.
Sure. And we gotta get into this popular myth that General George Armstrong Custer, right, was featured in this painting of Mr. Lovell's, but yet he was not, in my understanding, in the actual room of the surrender. So why do you think? Do you know of a reason why General Custer was featured pretty prominently in this painting when he wasn't in the room, and where was he during the surrender events?
Well, my understanding of this is that, based on those contemporary sources, based on the accounts of the men who were in the room, Custer is not present during the actual surrender. He is with his troops, with his cavalry division, when one of the first flags of truce comes in earlier that morning. And he may have been in the vicinity of the McLean house while Lee and Grant were meeting, but he doesn't actually come into the house until after the meeting's over. And basically, he's there to acquire a souvenir. He ends up getting the table that Ulysses S. Grant had used. Philip Sheridan, his commander, had supposedly bought it from McLean for $20 in gold and then given it to George Armstrong Custer as a gift for Mrs. Custer, for Libby Custer. So there's that connection. We know he probably had been in the room during all that, but not while Lee and Grant were there. So some historians, some artists have definitely taken that and put him into the room. Basic reason is, love him or hate him, he's a popular figure, he's recognizable. Wilmer McLean's lithograph featured George Armstrong Custer in the room as well.
Sure. Right. It's almost like, where's Waldo? Where's Custer at?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Oh, very well. So thank you, Chris. And now I guess our last painting that at least I know about is the Keithwacko painting. It looks like 2001. Yes. Can you describe that painting a bit and tell us a little bit more about Rocco and why he painted a new version in 2001?
Certainly. Well, just to briefly describe the painting, it also features the McLean parlor, pretty much a similar angle as Tom Lovell's painting, featuring the carpet and the drapes as they would appear today if you visited. Very vibrant colors again. Otherwise, the furnishings in the room are accurate. The Lee table on the left, the Grant table kind of in the middle of the room. There are 16 officers in the painting. 2 Confederate, which is accurate, Robert E.
Mhm.
Lee and his assistant, his military secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, the rest being with Grant. That's one of the things that a lot of these paintings, including Rocco's, get wrong in that they exaggerate sometimes the room size, but also the number of people in the room at any given moment. They want to put all these famous individuals in there, but in reality, for most of that 90 minutes, it was a pretty small group of people meeting. So a lot of these officers may have come in at the beginning or the end, and that was about it. But that's what Rocco continues with, is this larger looking room with a lot of people in it.
Sure.
Why he did it? He's basically commissioned by the National Park Service in 2001 to paint this painting and also an exterior painting of the McLean house as Lee and Grant leave. It'd been a long time since Thomas Lovell's 1965 painting, and I guess we wanted a more updated version.
Sure. Okay, yeah. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, it looks like a common theme with all these paintings is that there's a lot of people in all these paintings, actually, and
Yes.
sometimes they change and diversify. Is there anything else with any of the paintings that you want to talk about, Chris? But anything else that kind of jumps at you with these paintings?
Certainly. Well, up until Thomas Nast's in 1895, a lot of the artwork, again, portrayed Grant incorrectly in terms of his rank, being 4-star instead of 3, as I think I already mentioned, in a dress uniform at one occasion when in fact he was more of a simple field uniform. More of the recent artwork has fixed that. But even Keithwacko's painting, Grant looks almost a little bit too clean for having ridden 20 miles over muddy roads to get to the meeting. And one thing that every single one of these paintings gets wrong historically, unfortunately, is Robert E. Lee's uniform. Every single one of them shows what we would traditionally see a photograph of Robert E. Lee wearing a 3-star uniform, 3 stars on his collar, which is what he traditionally wore during the Civil War. The reality is at Appomattox, he wore his dress uniform, which is now in the possession of the American Civil War Museum, and it is a very different looking uniform than we're used to him seeing Lee in. And none of these artists, unfortunately, captured that correctly.
Very well. Yes, I remember seeing that. It was definitely distinctive looking versus all the other captions you see in the painting, and also other pictures you know of Robert E. Lee in as well too. So correct. Yeah. So also, Chris, I was curious. So we have a gap of any kind of image between the surrender itself and 1867. So we got 2 years. Obviously, the public would have known about the surrender via newspapers and other kind of media back then. Was there any kind of newspaper sketching, do you know of the surrender around the time it happened, or between 1865 and 1867, or was there none that you know of?
To my knowledge, there are no sketches done at the time or immediately after from the parlor, from the actual scene of the surrender itself. You do have sketches by Alfred Woad, by Eustace Collett, by other northern sketch artists that are embedded with the Union Army that send their sketches back to northern newspapers like Harper's Weekly, of the exterior of the McLean house as the generals leave. But that's as close as they get. And it's going to be the fall of 1865 before a photographer visits. Timothy O'Sullivan visits and gets exterior images of the house and other buildings in town. And that's it that I'm aware of.
Oh, very well. Yes. That's very interesting to me, at least. That's fascinating. So finally, Chris, wrapping up, it's been a great talk with you and about the different paintings of the surrender at the McLean House at Appomattox, and encourage people to go and visit, obviously, the McLean House and Appomattox National Historical Park too, and talk to Chris personally about these issues. But just on the last note here, Chris, since we've gone through all these paintings, do you have a particular favorite one that you like the best?
Well, yes. To be honest, I still would reference the Thomas Lovell painting probably more than others, just because of the scale of the room and the smaller numbers of officers in the room. I think that still holds a lot of accuracy in terms of understanding what it looked like. But the Keithwacko painting would definitely be second in that it brings up officers who the other paintings had not. For instance, Captain
Sure.
Robert Todd Lincoln of Grant's
Sure,
staff, who was in the
yes.
room, and he does not appear, to my knowledge, in any of the other paintings.
Right, that's right. Yes, yes, yes. And if you were commissioned to paint another painting, if you were an artist, would you change any of the painting? Would you how would you kind of do your painting if you chose to kind of paint your own interpretation based on your
Sure.
research?
Well, I think in terms of a painting of the actual surrender meeting itself, I think the initial moment when Grant arrives in the room doesn't necessarily get as much publicity as towards the end of the meeting. But frankly, there's so many other subjects of what happened here at Appomattox Courthouse that don't see as much attention in the artistic community. I know Don Troiani has a painting of Lee returning to his army after the surrender, but in terms of the battle itself that was fought here in the morning of April 9th, or the paroling process, the printing of the parole passes for the Confederate soldiers, there's a lot of different directions that artwork could go, rather
Sure.
than the meeting in the parlor.
Sure, very well. Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Very well, Chris. Well, again, Chris, very nice chat with you. And thank you very much for joining me here and describing some of these paintings here for us about the Surrender Appomattox. And again, yeah, please visit Appomattox Courthouse National Historic Site or Park if you can get a chance. And Chris, looking forward to maybe chatting with you sometime again on another future topic. So,
well, I definitely appreciate the invite, and yeah, look forward to doing this again sometime. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Chris.
Text reads images, Library of Congress, Wikipedia, and Wikimedia Commons. National Park Service logo.